BBC Radio Surrey.
Now here's a story that you will find not on the front pages but very much covered on the inside pages of many of the papers today, and it's a really troubling one. It's been called the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. The death of thousands of people who were given contaminated blood products. This week, a public inquiry into that disaster has begun, hearing how students at a school near Alton lost their lives after being offered treatment for haemophilia in the 1970s and 80s. The children at Treloar College, a school for disabled children, were given a drug contaminated with HIV and viral hepatitis. 72 of them died. The BBC's health correspondent Jim Reid has this report.
It's huge, amazing place, beautiful. To come here as an 8-year-old, it gave just freedom, total freedom.
Deep in the English countryside, Treloars is still a boarding school for children with physical disabilities. 40 years ago, it was home to boys with the blood disorder haemophilia. In the 1970s and 80s, more than 120 young haemophiliacs were taught here. Of that group, at least 72 lost their lives because of the blood treatments they were given. Now a public inquiry is going to look in detail at what happened at this school in Hampshire.
It's not a normal week.
Half a century on, Aid, Richard and Steve have returned here. As students, they were given a brand new drug at the NHS centre on this site.
Freeze-dried concentrate was sold to us as a miracle. We were told, if you take this, you will be able to live a normal life. You'll be able to do these things. You'll be able to play football, ride a bike. But we were never told the risks.
In the 1980s, that drug, known as Factor 8 or 9, was often imported from the United States. Some of the plasma used to make it was contaminated with hepatitis and later HIV. At just 15 years old, Aid was part of a group of boys at the school, taken aside and told he was HIV positive.
Quite tearfully, Doctor went around the room and said, "Who's positive? You have, you haven't, you have, you haven't, you have." And it was difficult, and I was back in science by 10 to 2. I didn't even get the afternoon off. My friend went outside and literally went to the horticulture department, picked up a pot and threw it against the Haemophilia Centre wall.
In 1983, HIV/AIDS was not just untreatable. Those infected also had to deal with the stigma of the disease. Alec Mcpherson was the head teacher at the time. Now 86 years old, he has agreed to give evidence at the public inquiry this week.
Most of them got this dreadful infection. Built a rage inside them against, why me, and why has this happened to me, and why have I got this? They shouldn't have done this to me. And they suddenly realised and discovered their future life was really limited.
Of the 122 haemophiliacs who went to this school at the time, just 32 are known to be alive today.
But when we come back to this wonderful school and, we've just lost so many people, we all ask ourselves, why me?
Why are we still here?
A series of hearings focused on the school are taking place this week as part of the wider inquiry into the use of infected blood products. Former pupils and their families want to know if more could have been done to protect the young boys involved.
That's Jim Reid reporting. It is BBC Radio Surrey. Let's bring in Clive Smith, who's the chair of the Haemophilia Society. Clive, morning to you.
Good morning, James.
What are you hoping will be the outcome of this inquiry?
I think lots of people have been waiting for this for decades, and so lots of people, for a start, they want people's voices to be heard, and yesterday we saw the start of that, certainly for the Treloars boys. Over the last few years we've heard lots of testimony from people who've been personally infected and affected by this. But I think first and foremost people want their voices to be heard. This is a very different tragedy to many of the other inquiries we've heard about over recent years, such as Grenfell and Hillsborough. Everybody knows about Grenfell and Hillsborough. It was a very visual event in terms of what happened. But in this situation, we've had around 5,000 people with haemophilia infected with HIV and hepatitis, and over 3,000 people have died. But not many people know about the story, and so that's been part of the fight, part of the battle to get this into the public consciousness, for people to actually understand what went wrong. People obviously want compensation, but with 3,000 people dead, for many people that's too late. So we want to know what went wrong and why. We want to know why the UK government did not become self-sufficient in blood products, despite Lord David Owen, the Health Secretary, saying in 1975 we would. Lord Kenneth Clarke will be giving evidence over 3 days at the end of July next month, and he will have many questions to ask, one of them being, why did the UK not become self-sufficient in blood products? Why did we have to import them from the US instead? And of course, import them from the US where people were donating, being paid for their donations, and they were drug addicts, prostitutes, prisoners, for example. A very different situation to that which we have in the UK, where people give blood voluntarily rather than on a financial basis.
Oh, it's just shocking. And you mentioned there, Clive, about people's voices being heard. Well, in Jim Reed's report there, we heard those voices, and what they have to say is really, really worrying. And look, it's been called the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. Do you think that is a fair assessment?
I think it is a fair assessment, and I think it's always very hard to hear those words, particularly when we look at what the NHS has been doing over the last year to 18 months. I think, largely speaking, the NHS does a fantastic job, but we certainly know, and certainly there was evidence about this yesterday, that some of the boys who were being treated at Treloars, they were part of trials, and they were completely unaware of that. They were being given lots of different products from lots of different companies over the space of a year, which quite frankly was not good practice. It's generally accepted with haemophilia you try and keep somebody on the same treatment rather than mixing and matching. So I'm afraid they were let down by the government, by the NHS and by the doctors at the time. We know as well, for example, that people with haemophilia were being tested for HIV without their knowledge. They were then not told about their diagnosis, and some of them then went on to infect their partners with HIV, who then went on to die. Some people, when they received their diagnosis about HIV, sometimes their partners were pregnant, and there was always the risk of the HIV being passed on to the child. And so some people actually went on to terminate pregnancies as well. So we have been let down by the government. We have been let down by the NHS, unfortunately. I think that is an accurate description.
Could it happen again?
I don't think this kind of scandal could happen again, but there's always the danger and risk that another scandal could happen. And I think we have to always be vigilant about this. I still think there is an imbalance in the relationship between patients and healthcare professionals in terms of doctors. Doctors don't always tell everybody all the information, and I think that power imbalance needs to be redressed. We certainly see that within haemophilia in terms of new treatments coming to market. There are new treatments such as gene therapy coming to market in haemophilia at the moment, and we very much need to make sure that we have registries and monitoring of all this going on. Sadly, I think in medicine, unfortunately, the ethics still follows the science, and if we learn nothing from this scandal, then the ethics needs to get ahead of the science.
Now, you, Clive, have haemophilia A. Can you
Yes.
give me an idea of the impact it's had on you?
I've grown up sort of over 2 generations of haemophilia care. So when I was very young, I spent a lot of time in a wheelchair and on crutches. I fortunately didn't miss much school, but it meant that when I did need treatment, it meant that I would have to go to hospital. Usually I grew up near Windsor and had to go to Great Ormond Street, which was obviously a big journey. I also had 2 brothers with severe haemophilia A, so sometimes, although I may be fit and well, it might have meant a family trip to the hospital, as it were. But certainly around 1990, when products changed, so we started using synthetic products, I was then able to treat myself at home. I now treat myself twice a week, and I'm incredibly active. I run, I cycle, I swim. And so the treatments that have come to market over the last 20, 30 years or so have been very much life-changing. So although being born in 1980 with haemophilia was a difficult time, I think anyone being born with haemophilia today should feel confident that the care is very good, the treatment is very good, and people should expect to lead a relatively normal life and a full life as well.
Well, good talking to you. When's the inquiry due to end? Does it have, number one, does it have an end date? And are you actually learning much from it?
We hope that the inquiry will report in around 2022, and yes, we are learning an enormous amount. There have been a number of expert groups who've given evidence to the inquiry about treatment of haemophilia, about hepatitis C, about HIV. We're also hearing from psychosocial experts as well. Obviously, the stigma around the viruses that people contracted was huge. We saw that yesterday with one of the witnesses, for example, who gave evidence anonymously. He'd been infected with hepatitis C. So the stigma still persists in relation to these viruses. So yes, we are learning a lot, but we also want to learn about what happened internally in terms of government, in terms of what they were doing at the time, and indeed more importantly what they weren't doing as well. So yes, it has been a very important experience. We are learning a lot, and we hope that lessons will be learned so we can prevent this ever happening again.
Clive, appreciate your time this morning, Chair of the Haemophilia Society, 16 minutes past 7 o'clock.